The great hall of the Galactic Assembly stretched for nearly a mile in every direction, and Sergeant Maya Chun had never felt smaller in her entire life than she did at this moment, standing alone on the speaker's platform. 12 species had sent their representatives to this place, and all of them were looking down at her with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to open contempt. The Velthari ambassador rose from his crystalline throne, and his forearms moved in elegant patterns as he spoke in a voice that echoed through the massive chamber. "So this is a human," he said, and the translator implant in Maya's ear converted his alien words into English with perfect clarity. "I must admit I expected something more impressive." Laughter filled the hall, and Maya kept her face completely still, even though her hands wanted to curl into fists at her sides. The Velthari stood 8 feet tall, and his body looked like it had been carved from living diamond, and his eyes glowed with an inner light that spoke of a civilization that had mastered the stars when humans were still living in caves. "You wish to join the Coalition Defense Force?" The ambassador continued, and his tone made it clear what he thought of that idea. "Your species has been capable of space travel for what amounts to a single heartbeat in galactic terms. And now you come before us asking to fight alongside warriors who have defended the galaxy for 10,000 years. Maya took a breath and reminded herself why she was here and why this moment mattered more than anything else in her life. "The hegemony is coming," she said, and her voice carried across the chamber without wavering. "You have lost 6 colony worlds in the last 2 cycles, and your defensive lines are collapsing faster than you can rebuild them. And you need soldiers." The insectoid Kreth delegate clicked his mandibles together in a sound that the translator rendered as harsh laughter. "We need warriors," he corrected her, "not primitives who measure their combat experience in planetary skirmishes that mean nothing on a galactic scale." Maya felt the anger rising in her chest, but she pushed it down because anger would not help her here, and only proof would matter to these ancient beings. "I have served 3 combat tours on Earth," she said. "I have fought in deserts and mountains and cities that were burning around me, and I have survived situations that should have killed me a dozen times over." "Fought whom exactly?" the Aurum delegate asked, and its gaseous body pulsed with colors that indicated amusement. "Other humans, I presume." More laughter echoed through the chamber, and Maya understood in that moment exactly how these aliens saw her species. They saw children playing at war while the adults handled the real threats. They saw primitives who had barely crawled out of their gravity well and who had no business standing in this sacred hall. They saw a joke. "Yes," Maya said, and her voice cut through the laughter like a blade. "We fight each other, and we have been fighting each other since the first human picked up a rock and used it to defend his family. And do you know what that has taught us?" The chamber grew quiet, and something in her tone had caught their attention. "It has taught us that there is no such thing as an unwinnable battle." Maya continued. "It has taught us that superior numbers and superior weapons mean nothing against an enemy who refuses to surrender, and it has taught us that the side that wants victory more will always find a way to achieve it." The Velthari ambassador leaned forward, and his crystalline features showed something that might have been interest. "Pretty words," he said, "but words are not proof, and the coalition requires proof before it grants membership to any species." Maya had prepared for this moment, and she knew exactly what she needed to say. "Then send me to the front," she said. "Give me a weapon, and point me at your enemies, and I will provide all the proof you require." Silence fell across the great hall, and the 12 species looked at each other with expressions that Maya could not read. "You understand what you are asking," the Kreth delegate said. "The hegemony's shock troops are called the Ravith, and they stand 9 feet tall, and their bodies can withstand plasma fire that would vaporize a human in seconds. And they feel no fear and no pain and no hesitation." "I understand," Maya said. "The survival rate for ground combat against the Ravith is less than 12%. the Urim delegate added. And that is for trained coalition soldiers with centuries of combat experience. I understand. Maya repeated the Velthari. Ambassador studied her for a long moment, and Maya met his glowing eyes without flinching. Why? He asked finally. Why would you volunteer for what amounts to certain death? Maya thought about her answer carefully, because she knew that everything depended on what she said. Next, because humanity has been watching the stars for thousands of years. She said, we have dreamed of this moment since the first human looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there, and now we finally have the chance to prove that we belong among you. She paused and took a breath, and because back on Earth, there are 8 billion people who are counting on me to open that door for them, and I will not let them down, even if it costs me my life. The chamber remained silent, and Maya could feel the weight of 12 civilizations judging her in. That moment, finally, the Velthari ambassador spoke. The assembly will grant your request, he said, and Maya felt her heart leap in her chest. You will be assigned to the defensive garrison on Kelrith Minor as a military observer, and you will have the opportunity to demonstrate whatever value humans might bring to our coalition. Maya bowed her head in acknowledgement. Thank you, she said. Do not thank us, the ambassador replied, and his voice held something that might have been pity. Kelrith Minor has been under siege for 15 days, and the garrison is expected to fall within the week. And we are sending you there because we expect you to die quickly and remove this embarrassing petition from our agenda. Maya lifted her head and looked directly at the ambassador. Then I will have to disappoint you, she said. She turned and walked out of the great hall, and she did not look back, and she did not let them see the fire that was burning in her eyes. 3 days later, she boarded a transport ship bound for the front lines, and as the vessel jumped into hyperspace, Maya Shun made a promise to herself. She would survive. She would fight, and she would prove to the entire galaxy that humanity was worthy of the stars. The universe had asked for proof, and Maya Chun intended to deliver it in the only language that mattered, the language of victory. The drop pod screamed through the atmosphere of Kelrith Minor, and Maya Chun gripped the safety harness as fire roared past the tiny viewport, and the entire vessel shook like it was coming apart at the seams. She had made hundreds of combat drops during her time on Earth, but none of them had prepared her for the violence of an orbital insertion through an active war zone. Plasma fire streaked past the pod, and the onboard computer screamed warnings about incoming threats, and Maya closed her eyes and focused on her breathing, because panic would not help her now. The pod slammed into the ground with enough force to rattle her teeth, and the harness released automatically, and Maya grabbed her rifle and kicked open the hatch and rolled out into a world that was burning. Kelrith Minor had been a beautiful colony world once, and she had seen pictures of its rolling hills and crystal clear lakes and forests that stretched to the horizon, but that world was gone now. What remained was ash and fire, and the distant thunder of explosions that never seemed to stop. A Velthari soldier rushed toward her, and his crystalline body was cracked and scorched, and his forearms were shaking. Human, he shouted. Thank the stars you survived the drop, but you need to get to the command bunker immediately because the situation has become critical. Maya followed him through a maze of trenches and collapsed buildings, and everywhere she looked, she saw wounded soldiers and burning equipment and the faces of beings who had given up hope. What happened? She asked as they ran. Hegemony strike, the Velthari replied. They hit the command post 6 hours ago and killed everyone inside. And now we have no leadership and no orders and no plan. They reached the bunker, and Maya stepped inside and found herself facing approximately 50 alien soldiers who were looking at her with expressions of desperation and fear. Who is in charge here? She asked. You are, a Kreth soldier replied, and his mandibles clicked nervously. You are the highest-ranking military officer still alive. Maya felt the weight of those words settle onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She was supposed to be an observer and nothing more, and now suddenly, she was responsible for the lives of everyone in this room. "How many troops do we have?" she asked. 312. The Velthari who had guided her replied. "Mostly engineers and support personnel, and very few have combat training. And the enemy? The Ravith number approximately 4,000, and they are advancing on our position from 3 directions, and they will reach us within 18 hours. Maya walked to the tactical display and studied the holographic map of the surrounding terrain, and her mind began working through possibilities that no one else in the room had considered. "This position is indefensible," she said finally. "We cannot hold this ground against those numbers. Then we are dead," someone said, and the despair in that voice was absolute. "No," Maya replied, and her voice was sharp and commanding. "We are not dead, because we are not going to stay here." She pointed to a location on the map, approximately 6 kilometers to the north. "There is a canyon here, and it is narrow and deep, and it has only one entrance, and that is where we are going to make our stand. The canyon is a trap." A Velthari officer protested. "If we go there, we will have no route of escape." Maya turned and looked at him with eyes that had seen more combat than he could imagine. "I am not planning to escape," she said. "I am planning to kill every single Ravith that follows us into that canyon." She began issuing orders, and something in her voice made everyone in the room listen. "You." She pointed at the Kreth soldier. "What is your designation?" Kreth do not use individual names in military contexts. You do now, and your name is Click, and you are in charge of explosives, and I want charges placed along both ridgelines of that canyon, and I want overlapping kill zones, and I want the canyon floor to become a graveyard for anything that walks into it. She turned to the Velthari. "You are in charge of evacuation, and I want everyone moving within the hour, and I want all supplies and ammunition transported to the canyon, and anything we cannot carry gets destroyed, because I will not leave resources for the enemy." For the next 6 hours, Maya worked without rest, and she transformed a group of terrified engineers and support personnel into something resembling a fighting force. She taught them things that no coalition training manual contained. She taught them how to set ambush, and how to create improvised weapons, and how to use terrain as a force multiplier. She taught them that victory was not about superior numbers or superior technology, but about superior will. When the Ravith finally arrived at the canyon entrance, they found nothing but empty trenches and abandoned equipment, and they assumed that the coalition forces had fled in panic. They were wrong. The Ravith commander ordered his troops into the canyon, and 4,000 killing machines marched forward in perfect formation, and they were confident in their overwhelming strength. Maya watched them from her hidden position on the ridgeline, and she waited until the canyon was filled with enemy soldiers, and then she gave the signal. The first explosion brought down 1,000 tons of rock onto the Ravith vanguard and buried their front ranks under an avalanche of stone. Then the crossfire began. 300 coalition troops opened fire from elevated positions on both sides of the canyon, and plasma bolts rained down on the Ravith below like a deadly storm. The Ravith tried to return fire, but they were trapped in a killing ground with no cover and no room to maneuver, and their numbers meant nothing in that narrow space. Maya fired until her rifle overheated, and then she grabbed a fallen Ravith blade and she dropped into the canyon below. The coalition soldiers watched in disbelief as a single human waded into the chaos with nothing but a blade and began cutting down Ravith shock troops that towered over her by 3 feet. She targeted their joints and the Ravith shock troops that towered over her by 3 feet, sensory organs and the gaps in their armored hides, and she moved through them like death itself had taken human form. When the secondary charges detonated, the Ravith commander finally ordered a retreat. But by then it was too late. Maya had found him. She killed him with his own weapon, and she stood over his body and roared a challenge that echoed through the canyon. And the surviving Ravith heard that sound, and for the first Time in their engineered existence, they felt something that might have been fear. The battle lasted for 3 days, and Maya-chan did not sleep for any of them. She moved from position to position, and she killed and killed and killed, and every time the Ravith thought they had found a weakness, she appeared to cut them down. When coalition reinforcements finally arrived, they found something impossible. They found Maya-chan standing on a barricade made of Ravith corpses, and she was covered in blood, and her eyes were burning with a fire that none of them had ever seen in any species. Her confirmed kill count was 216. She had lost 4 soldiers. The siege of Kelrith Minor was broken, and the Ravith army was destroyed, and a single human had done what entire coalition battle groups had failed to accomplish. Maya looked at the reinforcements, and she smiled a smile that held no warmth. "Took you long enough," she said. And then she collapsed from exhaustion, and her body finally gave out after 3 days of continuous combat. But she had survived. She had fought, and she had provided proof. The news spread through the coalition like wildfire through dry grass, and within days every species in the galaxy had heard the story of Kelrith Minor. A human had done the impossible. A single primitive from a backwater planet had broken a siege that should have ended in total annihilation, and she had done it with tactics that violated every established principle of coalition warfare. Maya-chan spent 2 weeks in a medical facility recovering from wounds that would have killed most other species, and during that time she received visitors from every corner of the coalition. Military commanders wanted to understand how she had achieved such a victory. Scientists wanted to study her biology and learn how a human body could survive 3 days of continuous combat. Politicians wanted to know what this meant for the war. Maya answered their questions when she felt like it and ignored them when she did not, and she spent most of her recovery time studying tactical reports and planning for what she knew was coming. The Galactic Assembly had summoned her once again. She arrived at the Great Hall exactly 30 days after the battle. And this time, the atmosphere was completely different. The laughter was gone. The contempt was gone. Every eye in the chamber watched her with something that looked like respect mixed with fear. And Maya walked to the speaker's platform with her head held high. The Velthari ambassador was the first to speak, and his voice had lost its mocking tone. "Sergeant Chun," he began. "The footage from Kelrith Minor has been analyzed by our best military strategists, and they have reached several conclusions that I must share with this assembly." He gestured, and holographic displays appeared showing the battle from multiple angles. "Your tactical decisions violated 17 established coalition combat doctrines." The ambassador continued. "You abandoned a fortified position in favor of terrain that our manuals describe as a death trap, and you engaged Ravith shock troops in close quarters combat despite knowing that the survival rate for such engagements is less than 3%. Maya watched the footage of herself cutting through Ravith soldiers with a blade, and she felt nothing but cold satisfaction, which is exactly why it worked. She said, "Your doctrines assume that both sides will behave rationally, and they assume that survival is the primary goal of every soldier, and they assume that no commander would ever order troops into a situation with such low odds of success." She stepped forward, and her voice grew harder. "The Ravith do not behave rationally, and they do not care about survival, and they will never stop coming no matter how many you kill, and that is why your doctrines are failing." The Kreth delegate leaned forward, and his compound eyes studied her with intense focus. "And humans are different?" he asked. "Humans are exactly the same," Maya replied. "We also do not care about survival when something more important is at stake, and we also will never stop coming, no matter how many of us you kill, and the Ravith have never encountered an enemy like that before." The chamber fell silent, and Maya knew that she had their attention completely. "You want to know how I broke the siege?" she continued. "I did it by refusing to play by the rules that both sides had agreed upon, and I did it by being willing to die, if that was what victory required." and I did it by understanding something that the Coalition has forgotten. She pulled up her own holographic display, and maps and projections filled the air around her. You are losing this war, she said bluntly. Not because the hegemony is stronger than you, because they are not, and not because they have better weapons or more soldiers or superior technology. She swept her hand across the display. You are losing because you fight like accountants, and you calculate acceptable losses, and you retreat when the odds fall below certain thresholds, and you treat every battle as a math problem with a correct answer. Her voice rose and filled the chamber. The hegemony calls that predictable, and they call it exploitable, and they call it weak, and they are right. The Orem delegate pulsed with agitated colors. And what do humans call it? They asked. We call it losing, Maya said, and we do not accept losing. She began walking among the delegates, and her presence seemed to fill the entire hall despite her small stature. Every species in this chamber clawed their way to the stars by refusing to die, and every one of you faced extinction at some point in your history, and every one of you survived because your ancestors were willing to do whatever it took to ensure the continuation of their kind. She stopped in front of the Velthary ambassador, but somewhere along the way you forgot what that felt like, and you became comfortable, and you started to believe that war could be civilized and clean and controlled. Her eyes burned into his war is none of those things. And war is brutal and ugly and terrifying, and the side that understands the truth will always defeat the side that pretends otherwise. The ambassador held her gaze for a long moment. You speak as if you want war, he said finally, as if you enjoy the killing. Maya shook her head. I hate war, she said, and her voice was quiet now. I hate what it does to people, and I hate what it forces us to become, and I hate that it exists at all. She turned and addressed the entire assembly. But hating war does not mean I will refuse to fight one, and it does not mean I will pretend that nice words and careful calculations can substitute for the willingness to bleed and die for what matters. She returned to the speaker's platform. I am not asking to join your coalition anymore, she said. I am asking you to let humanity save it. The chamber erupted in voices, and the delegates argued among themselves in a dozen different languages, and Maya stood at the center of the storm and waited. Finally, the Velthary ambassador raised his forearms and called for silence. What exactly are you proposing? Yes, Maya smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I am proposing that you let me bring more humans to this war, and I am proposing that you give us the worst assignments and the most impossible battles and the missions that everyone else has given up on. She looked around the chamber at the faces of beings who had once dismissed her as a primitive. And I am proposing that you watch what happens when a species that has been fighting for survival since the dawn of its existence finally gets the chance to show the galaxy what it can do. The assembly voted 3 hours later. The decision was unanimous. Humanity would join the war, and Maya-chan would lead them. 6 months after the vote, the first human expeditionary force arrived at Coalition Forward Command, and the galaxy would never be the same again. 2,000 soldiers stepped off the transport ships, and they came from every nation on Earth, and they brought with them the combined military knowledge of a species that had been perfecting the art of war for 10,000 years. Maya-chan stood at the front of the formation, and she wore the rank of major now, and her chest displayed medals from 6 different coalition species. The coalition commanders watched the humans assemble, and they did not know what to make of what they were seeing. The human soldiers carried weapons that the coalition considered primitive, and their rifles fired physical projectiles instead of plasma, and they wore armor that could not withstand a single hit from a Ravith energy weapon. But there was something in the way they moved, and something in the way they looked at the world around them, that made even veteran coalition officers feel uneasy. These are your reinforcements, a Velthary general asked, and the doubt in his voice was obvious. They look like they are preparing for a ground war on their own planet. That is exactly what they are preparing for. Maya replied, and that is exactly why they will win. The coalition assigned the human expeditionary force to what they called low-priority sectors, and everyone understood what that really meant. They were being sent to worlds that were already considered lost. They were being given missions that were meant to slow the hegemony advance while valuable assets evacuated. They were expected to die buying time. The humans had other plans. The first major engagement came on Thesser Prime, and a Ravith army 50,000 strong was advancing on the last coalition defensive position, and the evacuation transports needed 19 more days to complete their work. Coalition doctrine called for a fighting retreat that would slow the enemy while preserving as many troops as possible. Maya Chun called for something different. We hold this ground. She told her soldiers, we do not retreat, and we do not surrender, and we do not stop fighting until either we are all dead or 19 days have passed. The Battle of Thesser Prime became the stuff of legend. Human soldiers fought in rotating shifts, and fresh troops moved to the front lines while the exhausted and wounded rested and recovered, and then returned to fight again. They called it rotating the line, and it was a concept from an ancient Earth battle called Thermopylae, and every human soldier knew that story. 300 warriors had held a narrow pass against an army of hundreds of thousands, and they had bought time for their people with their lives. The humans on Thesser Prime did the same. For 19 days they held the mountain pass, and the Ravith threw everything they had at the human lines, and every day the humans pushed them back. When the evacuation was complete, the human expeditionary force had suffered 400 casualties. The Ravith had lost 12,000 soldiers. Word of the victory spread through the coalition, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about these strange warriors from the primitive planet called Earth. The next engagement came at the Void Station Archipelago and a hegemony fleet had captured 6 orbital platforms, and they were using them to stage attacks on civilian shipping lanes. Coalition commanders had written off the stations as unrecoverable because no one had developed tactics for fighting in zero-gravity environments. No one except humans. Maya assembled a team of specialists who had trained for exactly this kind of operation, and they called themselves Orbital Assault Troops, and they had been preparing for space combat since before humanity had even made contact with alien life. They launched from a stealth transport, and they crossed the void in armored suits, and they used magnetic boots and tether lines to attach themselves to the first station. What followed was a masterclass in close quarters combat. The humans turned every corridor into a death trap, and they used breaching charges to create new paths through the station, and they fought with knives and fists when their weapons ran dry. By the time coalition reinforcements arrived, all 6 stations had been captured, and the hegemony crews had been eliminated. The humans had lost 17 soldiers. The hegemony had lost over 3,000. But it was the Battle of Kreth, Homeworld's outer moon, that truly showed the galaxy what humanity was capable of. A Ravith army had broken through the defensive perimeter, and they were advancing on the last evacuation point, and there were still 10,000 civilians waiting for transport. The human commander on the ground was a young soldier named Private First Class James Okonkwo, and he had been separated from his unit during the initial assault, and he found himself alone with a damaged transport vehicle, and a decision to make. The transport was loaded with explosive ammunition, and it would not fly, but it could still drive. James looked at the advancing Ravith army, and he looked at the evacuation point filled with terrified civilians, and he made his choice. He drove the transport directly into the Ravith ammunition depot. The explosion killed James Okonkwo instantly, and it destroyed the entire depot, and it created a gap in the Ravith lines that allowed the evacuation to continue. Coalition soldiers who witnessed the attack could not understand what they had seen. A human had chosen to die, not because he was trapped, and not because he had no other options, but because his death would save lives that he considered more important than his own. The concept was so alien to Coalition thinking that they had no word for it in any of their languages. The humans had a word. They called it sacrifice Maya. Chun attended James Okonkwo's memorial service, and she stood before the assembled human troops, and she spoke about what his death meant. James knew that he was going to die, she said, and he drove that transport anyway because he understood something that our enemies will never understand. Her voice carried across the silent assembly. He understood that some things are worth dying for, and he understood that the measure of a warrior is not how long they survive, but what they accomplish with the time they have. She looked at the faces of her soldiers. The hegemony thinks they know what we are, and they think they understand human warfare, and they think they can predict what we will do. Her eyes hardened. They are wrong, and James Okonkwo proved that, and every battle we fight from this moment forward will prove it again. The human expeditionary force saluted their fallen comrade, and then they returned to the war. Maya Chun's personal kill count passed 1,000, and the hegemony placed a bounty on her head that was worth more than the annual budget of a small colony world. But more important than the numbers was what the humans had. Taught the Coalition Velthary engineers began building improvised weapons from industrial equipment. Kreth support personnel trained in human close quarters techniques. The Aurum developed gas dispersal tactics that turned their own biology into a weapon. The Coalition was learning to fight like humans, and the hegemony was beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. They had awakened something that they could not defeat. They had given humanity a reason to show the galaxy exactly what it was capable of. And humanity had answered with fire and blood and a refusal to surrender that the universe had never seen before. The holographic image flickered to life in the center of the Galactic Assembly Chamber, and every delegate in the room fell silent because they were looking at something that none of them had ever expected to see. The hegemony Dominarch had requested direct communication. In the entire history of the war, this had never happened before, and the hegemony did not negotiate, and they did not talk, and they conquered, or they were destroyed. And those were the only outcomes they recognized. The Dominarch's form solidified, and the assembly saw their enemy's true face for the first time. The creature was vaguely humanoid, with aristocratic features and eyes that held the weight of centuries of absolute power, and its presence seemed to fill the chamber. Despite being nothing more than light and energy, we request terms for cessation of hostilities. The Dominarch announced. The chamber erupted in chaos, and delegates shouted in a dozen different languages, and no one could believe what they had just heard. The hegemony was surrendering. Maya Chun stood in the corner of the chamber wearing her dress uniform, and the scars on her face told the story of a dozen battles, and her eyes watched the holographic figure with cold calculation. The Dominarch's gaze swept across the assembly and then stopped when it found her, the human. The Dominarch said, and its voice carried a weight that silenced the chaos around it. You are the one they call the Deathwalker, and you are the one who broke the siege at Kelrith. Minor and you are the one who has killed more of my soldiers than any other warrior in this war. Maya stepped forward, and she met the Dominarch's gaze without flinching. I am, she said simply. My intelligence services have compiled extensive files on your species. The Dominarch continued. We have studied your history and your biology and your psychology, and we have tried to understand how such a young civilization could produce warriors capable of defeating our Ravith. The holographic figure moved closer to Maya, and the assembly watched in tense silence. Your species has been capable of space travel for less than 50 years, and before that you spent 10,000 years killing each other with increasingly sophisticated weapons. The Dominarch's voice held something that might have been confusion. Your planet's history is a chronicle of violence, interrupted only by brief periods of recovery before the next war begins, and by every metric we use to evaluate civilizations, you should have destroyed yourselves generations ago. Maya said nothing, and she simply waited for the Dominarch to finish. And yet here you are. The Dominarch said, fighting our engineered killing machines with weapons made of metal and your own flesh, and sacrificing yourselves in ways that our psychological models cannot explain, an inspiring species that we considered already broken. To resist us, the holographic figure straightened and addressed the entire assembly. We asked the universe for proof that the coalition could threaten our expansion, and we received an answer that we did not expect. The Dominarch's eyes returned. To Maya, the proof was not in your weapons, because your weapons are primitive. And the proof was not in your numbers, because your numbers are insignificant. And the proof was not in your technology, because your technology is laughable compared to our own. A pause, and the chamber held its breath. The proof was in your willingness to die. The Dominarch's form flickered with what might have been emotion. Every engagement calculation fails when one variable is infinite, and your species' capacity for violence and sacrifice and persistence breaks every model we have built. The Velthri ambassador spoke up, and his voice trembled with hope. Then you surrender to the coalition. No. The Dominarch replied, we withdraw and we regroup, and we will study this species called humanity until we understand how to defeat them. The holographic figure's attention never left Maya, but for now and for the first time in our empire's history, we have encountered something that the mathematics of war cannot account for, and we have met a species that treats extinction not as a threat but as a challenge, and that considers death not an ending but a price worth paying. The Dominarch raised one hand in a gesture that might have been salute or acknowledgement. The universe asked you for proof human, and your kill ratio was sufficient. The holographic form began to fade, but it was not the numbers that silenced us, and it was your willingness to achieve them that broke our will to continue. The image flickered one final time. You have earned something that no species has ever earned from the hegemony, and you have earned our respect and our fear. The hologram vanished, and the chamber sat in stunned silence. Maya-chan looked at the alien faces around her, and she saw something that had not been there when she first stood in this chamber years ago. She saw hope. The Velthri ambassador approached her, and his crystalline features showed emotions that she had learned to read over years of fighting alongside his people. Major Chun, he said, on behalf of the entire coalition, I must ask you something. Maya nodded. How did your species become what you are, and what made humanity capable of achieving what we just witnessed? Maya thought about her answer, and she thought about Earth with all its wars, and all its suffering, and all its stubborn refusal to surrender. She thought about the countless generations of humans who had fought and bled and died so that their children could have a chance at something better. She thought about James Okonkwo driving his transport into an ammunition depot because saving strangers was worth more than his own life. She thought about the fire that burned in the human heart, and the fire that no enemy had ever been able to extinguish. We learned, she said finally, from every battle and every loss and every time the universe told us we could not survive, we disagreed. She looked up at the stars visible through the chamber's transparent ceiling, and her eyes held the weight of everything her species had endured to reach this moment. Maybe someday we will learn to stop fighting, and maybe someday humanity will become as civilized as you once were. Her voice grew hard. But until then, and until the universe stops trying to kill us, we will keep disagreeing. The Galactic Assembly rose to its feet, and for the first time in recorded history, every species present joined in unified applause for a single individual. Maya-chan stood at the center of the chamber, and she accepted the recognition with the same quiet dignity she had shown when they had laughed at her years ago. She had come to this place as a joke, and as a primitive and as a representative of a species that no one believed belonged among the stars. She was leaving as a legend. The universe had asked for proof, and humanity had answered. Not with words, and not with technology, and not with the cold calculations of civilized warfare. Humanity had answered with blood and fire and sacrifice. humanity had answered with the simple truth that there was no battle that could not be won by those who refused to accept defeat. Humanity had answered by proving that the stars belonged to those willing to pay the price for them, and the universe had heard that answer, and the universe had fallen silent. Major Maya-chan walked out of the Galactic Assembly Chamber, and she did not look back, and she knew that humanity's journey among the stars was only beginning. The hegemony would return someday, and new threats would emerge, and the galaxy would face challenges that no one could predict. But humanity would be ready, because humanity was always ready, because humanity had learned the one lesson that truly mattered. The universe does not give victory to the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. The universe gives victory to those who want it more, and no species in the galaxy wanted it more than humanity. The end.